Hello, my name is Ian Wilshire. I'm from the Christian Counseling Center in Harare. And today is the World Suicide Prevention Day, and it was suggested that I make a presentation regarding this subject of suicide for the public in general and for counselors, those that come across people who are very depressed and suicidal. And obviously, we want to be able to prevent this tragedy as much as we can. And so it's a huge topic, so I can just give you a very brief presentation today. I want to look at some of the causes of why people would commit suicide. I want to look at some of the main factors and the warning signs that are there. Most people who attempt suicide do give some kind of indication, some sort of warning. And we need to be aware of what those warning signs are. And then finally, what can we do about it? How can we intervene? How can we help someone who is suicidal? So let me start by looking at some of the causes. Again, it's a huge topic, and I'm just going to touch on some of them. Obviously, the main cause is when people are deeply, deeply depressed, when they are helpless and hopeless. They see no hope of the future. They absolutely despair. And that leads them to be suicidal. They can't see any other way out. So obviously depression, but then also someone who is depressed because of some kind of a loss. Maybe they've lost a spouse, or they've lost a child or a friend, and that causes them to be depressed. It's a reactive depression and makes them want to be suicidal. Or maybe they've lost their job or been fired, or they've suffered a failure at business. They've had all their hopes, all their eggs in this basket of some business venture, and it fails, it falls flat on its face. Or maybe the loss of health, where somebody, particularly if it's terminal or if it's health that is very painful, the symptoms are very painful and they just can't bear that pain, and there's no hope of them getting over it. So depression, loss, anger, surprisingly. Sometimes when people don't handle their anger properly, they suppress their anger, and that anger then turns inward and becomes self-contempt, self-loathing, which can lead to deep depression and be suicidal. Anxiety is another one, when there's ongoing pressure, ongoing anxiety. And again, people don't see a way out of it. That anxiety leads to depression, and it's kind of a stress, duress, and then people will look for ways to overcome it, and sometimes they choose suicide. And this is quite often the case with teenagers, with adolescents, where there's a lot of pressure put on them to perform at exam time. There's so much pressure on them that they must perform. We had a friend who was the hope of the family. He was a bright lad. He did very well academically, actually, but they had the hope for the family was on him, and so they sent him overseas. But every time it comes to exams, he would become mentally ill, and sadly, ultimately, he committed suicide. So ongoing anxiety can be the cause of suicide. Guilt or failure. I'm sure you've known of people who, maybe because they've gambled their money, or they have borrowed a huge amount of money and they just don't see a way of getting out of that debt. Or they've done something which they feel absolutely terribly ashamed of. We knew someone who at the college where we were at, he was a lovely Christian man, but he had an affair, and he just could not deal with the guilt that he felt of that sin that he had committed, and he ended his life. Obviously, if someone is involved in alcoholism or drug abuse, sometimes those things give them the courage to be able to commit suicide, so that's an indicator or a cause. Sometimes people commit suicide, they have a vindictive motive. They want to get back and punish somebody in their family. Maybe it's a spouse who has divorced them, or maybe it's parents who haven't accepted him, or someone that they have got a lot of anger towards, and they almost want to punish them by saying, well, this will hurt you if I commit suicide. So those are some of the causes of suicide. I want to now look at some of the symptoms or the warning signs that are there when someone is attempting suicide. And of course, the first one is this whole question of being depressed, deeply depressed. And as I say, the main symptoms of that are being hopeless and helpless. And the more helpless they are, the greater the risk that they will attempt suicide. And so I'm sure you'll be aware of some of the symptoms of depression, but that lethargy, very often people who are depressed and people who are suicidal withdraw from friends or family. And particularly if they are already depressed and then they suffer some kind of trauma or some kind of loss, that might be the trigger that just pushes them over the edge. So be aware of that, of the people around about you. I mentioned earlier someone who maybe has health problems, and particularly if those health problems are terminal, or if those health problems mean that they are in constant pain. Pain is so wearying. And when they can't see, or there's no cure for what they're suffering from, then they might consider that suicide is the way out. So be aware of that. So watch when people withdraw from friends or family, when they start making negative comments about themselves, or they start talking or writing or hinting about suicide. Pick up on those clues. Very often people are almost asking for help. They're sending out this message, and we can miss it if we're not aware of it. So another warning sign is if they've attempted suicide previously. Once they've tried once, that gives them, they know they have the courage to do it. So be aware of that. Here's a surprising one. When there's a sudden change in their mood, when someone is thinking about suicide, thinking of that way out, and then they finally make up their minds they're going to do it, actually there can be a lift in their mood. They suddenly feel a bit better. They've made the decision. And so be aware of that. If they've been very low, very depressed, and then suddenly they seem to be better, watch out and do take notice. If there's increased substance abuse, if they start giving away their possessions, or they start clearing the air over personal incidents from the past, they start neglecting their personal appearance. Maybe they constantly involved in accidents, little accidents, and there's no toleration of praise or reward. So all of those are warning signs that we need to be aware of for the people around about us. They're indicators that they might well be suicidal. Gender is an indication or is a factor. Females attempt more often than men, but men are 4 times more likely to complete the attempt. And by the way, sometimes we kind of laugh an attempted suicide off as a attention-getting mechanism. Oh, they're just trying to get attention. Well, maybe they are. Maybe that's exactly why they attempted. They talk about parasuicide, but that's still a problem. And sometimes people who are just trying to get attention actually succeed. And so don't laugh it off. Don't ignore it. It's still a need. There's still a reason to try and intervene with that kind of person. And then age are factors that we need to be aware of. Adolescence, and as the rates increase through adolescence, so in other words, the older they get into adolescence, the more likely they are to attempt suicide. The rates plateau off into adulthood. I think that's because their responsibilities are there. They might be married now and have children, but the rates increase again into older age. All things that we need to be aware of. So what do we do then? How do we help someone who might be suicidal? What are the ways of intervening? So the first thing to say is this, is don't be shy to raise the topic. If you can see someone is very depressed, they're very down, they're feeling hopeless and helpless, speak to them openly about it. Ask them, have you considered suicide? Very often they've been giving those little hints, and they might be very pleased to actually talk to someone about it. Then to ask them if they have considered suicide, to ask them, have they thought about how they might do away with themselves? What method have they thought about when they've thought about suicide? It's an indicator of the extent of how serious they are about suicide. And then finally, do they have the means? In other words, have they got the tablets that they want to swallow to kill themselves, or the rope that they want to hang themselves with? Do they have the means? Because if they do, then that's very serious. There's a very high risk then of them attempting suicide. And if it is high, then it's important that you inform someone. If it's an adolescent, their parents need to be told. Maybe a spouse for an adult, or a friend, or a GP. And you don't do that behind the person's back. You tell them, listen, I don't want you to die, and I want to intervene in this situation. And so I'm going to tell someone. Who do you think would be the best person to tell? Who might help you? And it might be necessary, for example, to actually take them to their GP, their doctor, who can help them medically. Insist that they do see somebody. So that's the first thing, to really talk about it. One of the things which I think is so important is when someone attempts suicide, they've got themselves into a situation where it's become intolerable. They are despairing of their situation, and suicide seems to be a way out. This to them is a way out of their unbearable situation. And one of the ways which I think can help enormously is to say to somebody who is attempting suicide or thinking about suicide, is to say, would you consider another way out? There is a way out of the situation, and it doesn't have to be suicide. And out of that, try and get them to agree that they will consider and pursue this other way out. And if you're a counselor and even a friend, I think it's important to have some kind of a contract. Get them to agree to it. And if necessary, write it down and get them to sign it, to say that they are not going to attempt suicide while they pursue or try this other way out. And then to form some kind of alliance with them. Say, I'm going to walk with you. I'm going to work together with you. Get their commitment that they are going to work at this other way out that you're talking about. And I think it's important that you're available to them. Give them your number, that whenever they're tempted or they're feeling very low, that they're able to get in touch with you and talk the thing through. And part of that might well be referring to a doctor, referring to a psychologist, maybe referring to a psychiatrist, referring to some sort of professional help. Even as a counselor, you can still walk alongside them, but they probably need that professional help as well. So be available to them. And I think it's important that you try and give them hope. That's what they've lost. They've lost all hope of getting out of the situation that they're in. And as Christian counselors, if you're a Christian, then we have a hope. Obviously, we don't want to be trite. We don't want to just throw verses at them and think it's going to go away all of a sudden. But I do think we do have a hope. And God's intention for us is to know that hope. The very reason that the Lord Jesus Christ came to this earth was because he loves us and he wants to give us hope. And so it might be an opportunity, very gently and wisely, talk about the hope that God has for us. And then if you are a counselor particularly, then if you have that contract with them, they're going to work at this other way out, then you need to look at the cause of the attempt of suicide or desire to commit suicide. So if it's that deep depression, then you need to counsel them through that depression. If it's the anxiety is behind the depression, then again, counsel them through that anxiety. Loss needs to be grieved. Help them grieve constructively. Help them to grieve in a way that will help them get through it ultimately. Anger, again, give them the tools to be able to express that anger appropriately. And if it's guilt or failure, then again, particularly as Christians, we can talk about dealing with that guilt in an appropriate and realistic way where they can be forgiven for what they've done. They can overcome the failure. God is the God of the second chance. And so again, you can talk them through. And often it's not just one of those things, often it's a combination of them, and you might need to work them through. At the Counseling Centre here, we use a model which we call the 5 circles. It deals with a person in 5 different areas of functioning. We function physically, emotionally, in our behavior, in our thinking, and spiritually. And we would want to work through each of those areas and find what's happening in each of those areas, and then how they can change. It starts from that spiritual circle, how loved they are, how they can find a security and a hope because they're loved, and how valuable they are to God, that they are valuable, they're not worthless. And purpose, so important, that God has a purpose for them. That's all in the spiritual circle. And once they know those things, then they can work that out in their thinking, and they can work that out in finding new behavior that comes from a different motivation, and that will hopefully change how they feel, and of course physically as well. So obvious, but needs to be dealt with as well. Just things like exercise and diet and taking some rest and recreation. All of those can be very helpful things that will help them deal with that depression or anxiety or loss. So I hope that that's been useful. Obviously a huge subject, but it just might be the very thing that helps you help somebody else who's dealing with this devastating experience of wanting to end their own life. Thank you.